Hey everybody, happy snow day. It is Dr. Gilchrist, and because we have already spent some time shaping Sniffy to bar press, I figured it would be a good time today to start talking about operant conditioning. So your textbook's going to cover a couple of different things, and one of the things that I simultaneously like about your textbook and do not like about your textbook is that they kind of separate basic principles of operant conditioning and schedules of reinforcement and punishment into separate chapters. Um, I'm going to largely talk about what happens in chapter 5 here with basic principles, but do be aware that some of chapter 6 is going to bleed into this a little bit. We might go into a little bit more detail with the schedules of reinforcement immediately after this. But in this section, we are going to talk about early research by E.L. Thorndike on his work on the law of effect, along with the early research on by B.F. Skinner. We will talk about the difference between operant conditioning versus instrumental conditioning because sometimes they get used interchangeably, and that's not entirely appropriate. We'll start talking about reinforcement. So we'll talk about positive versus negative reinforcement. We'll talk about shaping, and I will briefly touch on schedules of partial reinforcement. I'll then talk a little bit about the influence of contiguity and reward magnitude, as well as the role of frustration in operant conditioning, and finish up by talking about behavior modification. Now, this is a long set of slides, so we are probably not going to get through all of this today. I'll probably only talk for about 40 to 45 minutes to make it equivalent to class time, and whatever we don't cover, I will pick back up on Friday. So I'm going to start by talking about Thorndike's research and the law of effect, particularly noting Thorndike's puzzle box research, the law of effect, and the role that some of this plays with superstitious behavior. So you can kind of see the general setup of Thorndike's puzzle box. So he was one of the first people to see how behaviors could be modified as a result of experience. So he actually tried this with cats. Most of you know it with cats. If you check that link, you can actually see a video of this, but I'm not going to play it for reasons related to copyright. So basically, a hungry animal is going to be placed in a box. Now, this box has a variety of different simple responses. You could pull on a rope, you could press a lever, you could step on a platform, but you would have to do it in a certain sequence that would basically free the animal from the chamber, and as a result, you would get some type of a food reward. Now, Thorndike was largely interested in the time that it would take for the animal to escape, or what he termed escape latency. So how long would it take the animal to actually get out? Generally, the first time that you're going to put an animal in the box, it's going to take a long time for that animal to escape. And it's also going to largely happen in kind of a haphazard way, like there's no intentionality behind it. They're largely getting out by accident. But what's especially interesting was that Thorndike, once the animal escaped, the animal would go back into the same puzzle box and he would basically try to see how long it took the animal to escape each time. And one of the things you'll notice when we look at escape latency is, as I kind of mentioned, that first trial, largely going to take a while. This is about 150 seconds, so it took about three minutes or so. But with repeated presentations and with increasing trials, the escape latency basically declined. And Thorndike largely believed that what was happening was this increasing association being made between the stimulus, the inside of the puzzle box, and basically the response, which is whatever opened the door. So Thorndike basically termed this the law of effect. So if in a particular situation a response is followed by a satisfying effect, a positive effect, the response is going to become associated with that situation and is going to be more likely to be reduced on future trials. Responses that do not create a satisfying effect or a satisfying response will not be repeated. So the law of effect is basically your behavior is ultimately shaped by the effects that your behavior produce or the consequences that your behavior produces. So basically what Thorndike has found is reinforcement, in particular the principle of positive reinforcement. Things that are followed by positive consequences or positive effects are more likely to be repeated. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, Guthrie and Horton back in 1946 also put cats into puzzle boxes. And in particular, what's critical here is that Guthrie and Horton found a little bit more insight into how these behaviors are strengthened. So once again, they kind of put cats in a puzzle box, but the puzzle box looked a little bit different than the series of pullers, levers, and platforms that Thorndike did. Their puzzle box had a pull in the center of the chamber, and basically you've just had to tip it in a particular direction to open the door. So Guthrie and Horton basically placed a camera outside of the chamber that photographed the cat at the same instant that the door swung open, so they actually ended up having a record of how the cat had basically gotten the response each trial. And so Guthrie and Horton actually found something really cool. Cats' behaviors in those puzzle boxes are initially variable. Different cats moved and manipulated the pull in different ways, but with increasing learning, each cat's behavior became more stereotyped. So different cats had different styles for moving the pull, but the method of manipulating the pull for a given cat became more stereotyped after time. And like I said, there was still a lot of variability between the cats. And I'll show you an image of this on the next slide. So from this, this was basically something that Guthrie and Horton did not name. This was actually named by Brown and Hairstein. This is called the stop action principle. But Guthrie and Horton's results do show the stop action principle. Basically, the reinforcer is basically there to stop the animal's ongoing behavior, and it's basically going to strengthen the association between the situation and those particular behaviors that were occurring right at the moment of reinforcement. So you can kind of see this in a certain way. So here are some drawings of the photographs from Guthrie and Horton. Here we have cat B on a series of 24 trials. Here we have cat G on a series of 24 trials as well. And what you can kind of see is that both of these cats have very different movements. But what you will notice is that over time, so for example, B does a few different things to move the pole, but by about B6, you start to see some more consistency in behavior. So basically, whatever behavior was going on at the moment of reinforcement is ultimately going to be strengthened. Notice that G has a very different way of manipulating the pole, but again, with increasing trials, we start to see more specific repeated behavior. So the stop action principle basically has been thought of as underlying a lot of superstitious behavior. And this is what Skinner actually believed. So basically, the stop action principle, just as a reminder, any behavior that you were immediately doing at the moment of reinforcement is going to become associated with that reward and thus is going to be strengthened. So Skinner kind of found that if the stop action principle holds, behavior can become strengthened by accident and only because they became associated with the reinforcement. So in 1948, Skinner did something called the superstition experiment. And so he basically took 8 pigeons and he put them in separate chambers and he presented them with grain as reinforcement every 15 seconds. And here's the thing, the pigeons could have chosen to do nothing. They could have chosen to do nothing and they would have received that grain. So regardless of what the pigeons are doing, they're getting reinforcement. Skinner basically had the pigeons spend some time in the chamber and then he saw what the birds were doing. So he found that a majority of them had clearly defined behaviors that they performed between the presentations of the grain. So a couple of examples from your textbook. One bird made a few counterclockwise turns between reinforcers. Another made pecking motions at the floor. You can see that this one is pecking the disc. A third poked its head into the upper corner of the chamber. 2 swayed from side to side. A bird tossed its head in an upward motion. And these happened repeatedly despite the fact that there was nothing that these birds needed to do to get reinforcement. So whatever the birds were doing prior to reinforcement happening became accidentally strengthened. So behaviors that occurred at the time of reinforcement were strengthened, and Skinner believed that many of the superstitious behaviors and ritualistic things that we see people do in games of chance might explain why people do those things, because they've been accidentally reinforced in the past. So for example, people bringing little particular markers for bingo games or performing certain behaviors like blowing on dice, those have probably been reinforced in the past, and as a result, they get strengthened. So one particular example that comes out of this is Lee's computer task from 1996. So in this particular case, this computer task basically was randomly telling people, oh, you won, or oh, you lost. So again, there was nothing that people actually needed to do to get a reward. So based on just random chance and the algorithm of the computer program, you would either win or lose. But there were different icons that you had to select that were randomly associated with either taking a win or taking a loss. And despite the fact that the icons really had nothing to do with win or loss, students were more likely to select icons that were associated with instances in which they won, and if they lost, they were going to be more likely to switch to different icons. So what about societal superstitions? So Skinner even believed that superstitions for like sports or eating certain foods before games or things like that, it's possible that those societal superstitions were initially valid. So there's a superstition that it's bad luck to walk under a ladder. And in previous instances, that's probably true. Ladders by their very nature are unstable, and because they are unstable, it is highly likely that those could have hurt people. But they're still often highly perpetuated. So superstitions that are widely held, like 13 being unlucky, are usually going to happen through communication or through media, not through actual personal experience of this. And oftentimes, when they are perpetuated, it's either because of rumor or because of random coincidences. So moving on from the law of effect, we now need to talk about the work of B.F. Skinner and the importance of contingency. So I want to start by talking about Skinner's notion of what is called a free operant. So thinking about kind of Skinner's research in particular, in this particular case, you put a cat in a puzzle box, the cat makes the response, and as a result, we only get one response per trial in this case. And this is what is called a discrete trial procedure. But Skinner is notable because Skinner basically makes use of a response that the animal can do repeatedly without experimenter intervention. So lever bar pressing with rats, pecking discs with keys that can be recorded. So procedures that make use of these multiple responses without experimenter intervention is what is called a free operant procedure. And this can be contrasted to a discrete trial procedure where you are unable to make a repeated response for trials. So a couple of major distinguishing characteristics about the free operant procedure: the operant response can occur at any time, and it can occur repeatedly as long as the participant is in the chamber. Additionally, these don't require a lot of effort, and so you can observe multiple changes in response rate. So whereas escape latency was Thorndike's variable of interest, Skinner is going to be interested in a response rate instead, and how that response rate changes over time or with other environmental variables. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the basic principles of operant conditioning. So this is very similar to a lot of the phenomena that we see with classical conditioning. So we can have acquisition, where we form an association with a behavior and a response. So that's our acquisition here. So a particular response and its consequences. I'm going to put a big asterisk on that because that's not exactly the association that's being made, but it is part of it. So we make an acquisition, an association between the behavior and the effects. That can be extinguished. So if I train Sniffy to bar press, but then I stop rewarding Sniffy for bar presses, Sniffy will stop pressing the bar. That response will extinguish. We can still get spontaneous recovery, and we can also see generalization and discrimination as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like later on. So we still have these phenomena that we saw in classical conditioning, but the nature of the association is going to be different. Now, when we talk about operant conditioning, we need to talk about the notion of a contingency. So a contingency is basically a rule that B will happen if and only if A is present. So if I have B, if and only if I have A, I will get B. So you might think that in operant conditioning, this underlying rule or contingency is that I will only, if and only if I make a response, will I get a reinforcer. And sometimes in some of my other psychology classes, you will hear me define operant conditioning as making an association between a behavior and its consequences. And while some of that is very necessary, that is not actually the contingency that is being learned in operant conditioning. Rather, B.F. Skinner believed that there were three different components, or what are termed a three-term contingency. So we have three different parts. We have the environmental context, so the context or situation in which a response will occur. So that's SD, or a discriminative stimulus. Then we have the response, and then we have the reinforcing stimulus. So we have to have a contingency between a discriminative stimulus, a response, and the reinforcing stimulus. So a discriminative stimulus is basically something in the environment that lets you know that only when this particular context is present will making a response lead to a reinforcer. So basically, in this particular case, let's say that I train a rat to press a bar, and I only give it food for bar presses when the light in the operant chamber is on. The light now functions as a discriminative stimulus. And here's the thing, it's possible that the discriminative stimulus is just being in the Skinner box. So if we don't have a light or a tone present, but the rat is getting reinforced every time it presses the bar, the Skinner box becomes the discriminative stimulus for this particular instance. So before we move on to talking a little bit about the principles of reinforcement, I need to talk about the difference between instrumental and operant conditioning. So sometimes in some of my other classes, you will hear me again use these interchangeably, but the difference between instrumental and operant conditioning is a little bit more complex than this. So instrumental conditioning is a conditioning procedure in which the environment contains the opportunity for a reward. In this particular case, that would be something like Thorndike's research. Being in the puzzle box is a form of instrumental conditioning. Now, when we compare this to operant conditioning, this is when a specific response will produce reinforcement, and the frequency of response determines the amount of reinforcement that is obtained. So for example, if I only reward Sniffy for 15 bar presses in a row, which is a fixed ratio schedule, that would be a form of operant conditioning. Now, to be clear, sometimes these are interchangeable. Sometimes operant conditioning can't, or sometimes instrumental conditioning can be operant conditioning, but sometimes these are different from each other. So how do we tell the difference? In operant conditioning, there's not going to be any constraint on the amount of reinforcement that the subject can actually obtain. Learning equals how frequent the response is and how consistent the response is. So let's talk about reinforcement or reward. So reinforcement can occur for primary reinforcement, and we can also have what is called secondary reinforcement. So primary reinforcers are basically those things that have reinforcing properties that are generally going to be innate. They are biologically relevant. So this could be things like food or things like that. We can also have what are called secondary or conditioned reinforcers. So basically, these are going to gain reinforcing properties through their associations with primary reinforcers. So, for example, in 1938, Skinner basically gave rats pairings of a clicking sound and food. So clicking sound was presented and so was food. In the second part of the experiment, food was no longer presented, but the rats would still press a bar when it produced a clicking sound. So the clicking sound is not a primary reinforcer, but because it was repeatedly paired with food, it gained reinforcing properties. So at some point, if no food is presented, that clicking sound will no longer produce interest. So if we want a secondary or conditioned reinforcer to maintain its power, we need to occasionally pair it with a primary reinforcer. Now, there is a special class of secondary or conditioned reinforcers that are called generalized reinforcers. So basically, this is a group of conditioned reinforcers that can be associated with a wide variety of primary reinforcers. And one of the best examples of this is money. Money can be exchanged for a lot of different things that are inherently reinforcing for a lot of people, like food, clothing, things, entertainment, and stuff like that. Now, again, it is still a conditioned reinforcer. If money is no longer possible to be exchanged with primary reinforcers, it will lose its reinforcing capability. So what makes something likely to be a secondary reinforcer? So first of all, the bigger the magnitude or the more innately reinforcing that the primary reinforcer is, anything that's paired with it will most likely become a secondary reinforcer. So if it's really good food, like we're not talking like your standard rat chow if we're dealing with rats, and yes, Purina rat chow is a thing. If it were something like the Fruity Pebbles that we used to feed rats in our Skinner boxes in my learning and conditioning class, that's a pretty big magnitude. That's a pretty positive primary reinforcer. Anything that's paired with it is likely to be a secondary reinforcer. Additionally, the more primary and secondary pairings that you have, the more likely something becomes a secondary reinforcer. And then finally, the time that elapses between the presentation of the conditioned reinforcer and the primary reinforcer. The shorter that timing is, the more likely they are to be associated with each other, and the more power that secondary reinforcer gets. Now, one major principle, especially later on when we start talking about punishment, we need to talk about the difference between reinforcement and punishment. And we need to talk about the difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So I want to be incredibly clear. If you want to figure out if something is a reinforcement or a punishment, you need to focus on what happens to a behavior after the consequences. If it increases or makes a behavior more frequent, you're dealing with a reinforcement. If you are seeing a decrease or a weakening of behavior, you are looking at a punishment. So reinforcement always increases a behavior. Now, where people tend to get tripped up is the difference between negative reinforcement and punishment. Sometimes if you watch TV shows, they will use negative reinforcement instead as a term for punishment. Negative reinforcement and punishment are not the same thing. Negative reinforcement increases a behavior. Punishment decreases a behavior. So when we talk about positive and negative, positive means that we are adding something. Negative means that we are taking away something. So positive reinforcement is an event that is added to the environment that's going to increase the frequency of the behavior that produces it. So that could be a paycheck for a job well done. That could be praise from a teacher, candy every time that you answer a question correctly. Negative reinforcement is increasing a behavior by removing a stimulus that is aversive. And sometimes some people refer to this as omission. So an example of negative reinforcement, for many of you that have modern cars, like more modern vehicles that were produced in the 21st century, they want to make sure that you wear a seatbelt. When you get in the car, if you don't put on your seatbelt right away, at some point, the car will start to beep at you, very obnoxiously, in fact. And the only way to get that beeping to stop is by buckling your seatbelt. Buckling your seatbelt is the behavior that removes the aversive stimulus, the obnoxious sound. And in the future, you are going to be more likely to buckle your seatbelt to avoid that negative sound. Another example is taking something like ibuprofen or aspirin for a headache. That behavior removes the aversive negative stimulus, and as a result, that increases the likelihood that you will engage in that behavior in the future. So again, in both of these cases, we are going to see an increase in behavior. In the case of positive reinforcement, we are adding something good. The behavior adds something good. In the case of negative reinforcement, the behavior removes something aversive. So now let's talk a little bit about shaping. So what is shaping? So shaping is going to come into play anytime that you are trying to train somebody to learn something new. So we are going to reward successive approximations to a target behavior. So something that you kind of saw when we worked with Sniffy on Monday is that there's a major problem when you start shaping bar presses. The rat may actually be afraid of the noise of food entering the magazine or the hopper. So what we had to do was called magazine training. You have to turn the sound of food entering the hopper into a conditioned reinforcer. The sound becomes associated with food, and that becomes a conditioned reinforcer associated with our primary reinforcer of food. So you first have to do magazine training where the rat associates the bar press with food. Now, once you've done the magazine training, you need to shape the bar presses. And like we saw previously, the Skinner box, as you saw with Sniffy in the Skinner box, rats move around in variable ways. So to get the rat to eventually bar press, you're going to need to shape that behavior. You need to reward closer and closer approximations to the bar pressing behavior that you want to see. So first you start by only rewarding the rat when it moves toward the rear of the chamber. Once it's doing that consistently, then you only reward it when it rears up on its hind legs near the back of the chamber. Once it's doing that consistently, then you reward only one paw on the bar and then both. And occasionally, as you saw with Sniffy, he's going to press the bar by accident a couple of times, but you need to keep reinforcing that behavior because if you keep doing that, the rat will eventually learn that pressing the bar is the only way to get food, and at that point, you have successfully shaped those bar presses. Now, how would this work in everyday life? Your book has a really funny example that I wanted to share with you, and I want to say, please don't try this on me. So I'm in the 9th edition. I'm on the International Student Edition, and this comes from page 113. At many colleges and universities, there are stories about how the students in a large lecture course collaborated to shape the behavior of their professor. In one such story, a professor who usually stood rigidly behind the lectern was reinforced by his students for any movement, and by the end of the hour, he was pacing back and forth and gesturing wildly with his arms. In another story, a professor in an introductory psychology course lectured from an elevated stage. The students secretly agreed to reinforce the professor for any movement to the left. The reinforcers they used were listening attentively, nodding their heads in understanding of what he was saying, and taking notes. When the professor moved to the right, they stopped delivering those reinforcers. They would stop taking notes, yawn, look bored, and look around the room. The systematic delivery of reinforcers for movement to the left was apparently quite successful, for legend has it that only about halfway through the lecture, the professor fell off the left side of the stage, which was only about 18 inches high. Stories like this suggest that shaping can work even when the subject is unaware of what is going on. Now, in particular, with behavioral modification, this can be used with a variety of different things. Your textbook talks in particular about shaping and helping behavior of a pole vaulter, but I also want to talk about using it with drug abuse, with cocaine users basically taking methadone. So basically, they wanted to decrease their use of cocaine. So basically, every time they would test over the period of several weeks, they needed to have their urine show a 25% reduction in cocaine metabolites or a bigger reduction since their last test. So they would get vouchers for things like movie tickets or other things. And what they ended up finding, this was more effective in reducing cocaine than requiring abstinence and cold turkey quitting. This comes from Preston and colleagues in 2001. This can also be used to help children with cognitive impairment. This can also be used with different types of phobias and problem behaviors. So, for example, sometimes kids with autism have difficulty trying new foods. They prefer certain foods that are safe to them. So you can use reinforcement to basically help children eat a variety of different foods that would be good for their health instead of just always returning to like dino chicken nuggies and mac and cheese. So now we're talking very briefly about the schedules of partial reinforcement. We will hit more of these later in chapter 6 in your book. But before we discuss the 4 schedules, so when you were shaping Sniffy to bar press, you were doing what is called continuous reinforcement. In our shaping, Sniffy was reinforced for every single bar press. And like I said, this is called continuous reinforcement. Behavior becomes reinforced every single time it occurs. But the truth of the matter is that most of the time, our behaviors are not continuously reinforced. So for example, every time I give a lecture, I don't necessarily get a big bag of money for every single lecture that I do. I get paid for every 2 weeks. I do not necessarily get paid with every single good lecture. So one of the things that we find is that we have, for most of the things that we do, a schedule of partial reinforcement. And this is probably one of B.F. Skinner's greatest discoveries in this case. So to go into a little bit about this finding, he discovered these schedules by accident. So basically what happened is that Skinner had a bunch of rats that were in their Skinner boxes, and they were going to continue performing these behaviors over the weekend while he was gone. And it turned out he didn't have enough food pellets for the weekend. And so he had an idea to make sure that the rats were still going to be in their experiment. He ended up spreading out the pellets by only reinforcing the rat every minute. So they had to bar press within this 1 minute period to receive reinforcement. So he's not going to continuously reinforce them. He is only going to reinforce them some of the time. So he was a little nervous about what would happen over the weekend, but when he came back, he came to a very interesting discovery. He basically found that the behavior that the rats were doing when they were only reinforced some of the time, not every time they performed a behavior, he found that the behavior was stronger, steadier, and more resistant to extinction as a result. What you are looking at here is how rat behaviors and animal behaviors in operant conditioning used to be recorded. This is what is called a cumulative recorder. This is a big roll of paper, and you can see here that this pen is marking reinforcements when they happen, and based on the rate of response and the slope of the line, you can actually see how behaviors change. So this is going to look really similar to the cumulative recorder that you have on your Sniffy software. Reinforcements that are given to animals for their behavior are marked with a little hash mark here. Here, if the line is flat, there is no responding. If we start to see a small upswing right here with a very minimal slope, we have slow responding. Here, we have a very high rate of responding. We get a much bigger slope. That may start to level off as a deceleration in behavior. And here, again, we can see an acceleration in behavior. So I'm going to start with what is called the fixed ratio schedule, and I'll talk about the other 3 schedules when we start class on Friday. So the fixed ratio schedule is basically when a reinforcer is administered after a set number of responses. So for example, if you hear that the schedule used was FR50, what this means is that the rat was reinforced after making 50 bar presses or 50 responses. And if we look at a fixed ratio response on a cumulative recorder, it's going to look a lot like this. It's a very clear stop and go pattern. So we get very rapid responding, the reinforcement happens, and we get a pause. And then we get rapid responding, and then a pause. So we get this very clear stop and go pattern. This is referred to as the post-reinforcement pause. And later on, we'll talk about some theories as to why the post-reinforcement pause happens. But one thing that you do need to know is that this post-reinforcement pause actually becomes larger as the number of responses increases. So if I have one rat that is on a fixed ratio of 25 bar presses and another that is on a fixed ratio of 50, the rat that is making 50 responses before reinforcement will have a bigger post-reinforcement pause. So here are some everyday examples of fixed ratio schedules. So frequent flyer miles, the more miles or trips that you fly, the more points that you get. Buy X number of coffees or sandwiches, get the next one free. And then piecework in factories. The more pieces that you produce or the more things that you assemble, the more you get paid. So we're going to stop here. We'll pick up talking about the variable ratio schedule next time, and I will see you then. Bye.